Hello, dear listeners. Today's episode is on Ian Watt's Rise of the Novel, a work of scholarly academic criticism that focuses on three main authors from the 18th century novel: William Defoe, Samuel Richardson, and Henry Fielding. John and I talk about lots of stuff on this one, from the recent influx of Barnes and Nobles due to the prevalence of romantasy and book talk, to the sort of formalistic arguments Watts makes about the appeal of the novel, from its psychological complexity to the ability for the novel to present a assessment of society. Along the way, we talk about the benefit of reading academic criticism, the benefit of reading 18th century novels, as well as the sort of phenomenon of mass literacy. So it's a wide-ranging novel, and it reminded me a lot of being back in coursework, but, you know, in a fun way, because it's a podcast and not actually being in coursework. So, as always, we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Well, welcome back, ladies and germs, to the Infinite Library. I'm your host, John.
I'm your host, Ben.
And we're doing something a little bit different this week. I recruited Ben to read some nonfiction. This might be the first time we've done. I mean, I guess Ryan Ruby, you could maybe argue, is nonfiction.
Or yeah, I guess that would be the most one. The most, like, it's because Ryan Ruby was a sort of history essay, and this is a lot like that as well.
Yeah, but this is like the first time we've done like a full on like academic like monograph for the show. I asked Ben to join me in reading Ian Watt's pretty seminal work, The Rise of the Novel.
And listeners, I had a full grad school relapse where I took exhaustive notes because I was worried if I missed something I'd made a fool of in the classroom discussion. Which means, listeners, you're playing the role of the grad student who either didn't do the reading and is letting the smart people talk, or they're not comfortable enough talking and they're just sort of silently observing people talk. So,
yeah, when I came to Ben with this, he was like, "No, don't make me. I just got clean." And I was like, one more job, Ben. One more job.
One more coursework. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll kind of lay out my reason for wanting to do this for the show, just since it is kind of out of our usual wheelhouse. Listeners, might surprise you. I don't know if it's actually ever come up on the show. I do not have an English degree or a literature degree of any kind. I studied religion and art history in my undergrad, and unlike Ben, I didn't go on to grad school. I went to the grad school of hard knocks, where I got a PhD in hustling and grinding. So coming to the show, you know, in the interest of being able to feel confident talking about literature, I have kind of on my own time been picking through, you know, some of the more important works and, you know, kind of literary theory and criticism. And this was one that, you know, I'd heard about, and it seemed interesting from the standpoint of stuff we've talked about on the show before, both in terms of kind of the novel as form, but also kind of in terms of the way that, you know, historical and material forces have shaped the things that we read. You know, this is a work of literary theory, but just as much it's a work of kind of really pretty materialist historical critique of kind of where the novel came from and the material forces that shaped its history, more than sort of treating it as just a thing that emerged from the ether.
Yeah, and he spends time talking about how much a book would have cost in the 18th century, the ways books were sold, the sort of philosophical ideas that influenced the rise of the novel. And so it's a lot more contextual and almost sociological, just as much as the, close readings of literature that you could expect from academic literary criticism.
Yeah. And I think that really the main thing for me here, and, I'm sure we're going to get to this over the course of our conversation from here. Ben, I'm sure you've seen this just as much as I have, the seemingly endless run of articles. I swear, probably a dozen of them come out every year for I don't know how long, far longer back than I've been paying attention, declaring the novel is dead.
Yeah.
People don't read like they used to.
Especially men.
Yeah. Men don't read as much as they used to. They certainly don't read big, serious books. Everyone is on their phones, blah, 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 blah. I think there's a little bit of truth to that. The novel is definitely no longer as influential an art form as, it was at the time Watts is writing this, or the time Watts is writing about. But it is still, I think, pretty vital, even if kind of market forces have really made being a novel writer like a very difficult career track to follow. And I kind of am hoping that as we kind of talk through where the novel comes from and where it's been, maybe we can think about kind of where the novel is right now and where it might be going here in the future.
Yeah, and I think, I certainly agree with that, John. I also am into reading this kind of stuff because I think knowing about some of the, as I was saying, contextual background to novel writing is really important. And I feel like you can sort of get some explanations for things that you wouldn't get otherwise, or that or it's just sort of like, well, that person reads because of this, and it's just like, hey, there's actually a historical background to this. There's a reason people read novels that's not just, education or status signaling or to appear educated. And I think you can also get the kind of philosophical currents that inspire certain literary production, which I find that stuff to be absolutely fascinating. Because again, as I was saying, to John on a previous episode, you're raised as a new critic because it's easy to teach new criticism in high school where you just look at only the text. And while, again, it makes sense from a logistical standpoint, it's sort of realizing that there's a whole other world out there in terms of like we were saying, economic forces, historical forces, philosophical forces. And that stuff is excellent and fascinating and interesting. And it's not just the text, so again, it's sort of being shown another world, and I think that's useful to know about.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Ben. And I think that, again, it gets down to some pretty key questions, I think, in terms of modern literature. I know we're kind of recording this in the aftermath of the latest moronic scandal in literature, Brodernism, which is the recently proclaimed portmanteau of bro and modernism, which describes white guys who read smarty pants translated novels and act like they're better than people because of that.
Yeah,
or something.
As we all know, I walk up to my bros, I do the complicated handshake, and I say, "Musil, bro, you've been reading that Musil?" And he's like, "But Thomas Pynchon, bro." And then we just stand there for 15 minutes, doing this Hungarian author, that Hungarian author, and then eventually we run out of things to say, and then I high five him, and then we walk away. So.
But, kind of on the topic of what you were saying earlier about men not reading anymore, I think there's this very overwhelming urge right now to moralize reading.
Yes.
Which is very much in the Brodernist critique. The idea that they're reading these books instead of reading something else, which the guy who wrote that piece never specifies what they should be reading instead.
He seems to suggest that these books aren't political enough. and that they're mostly been used as status symbols, and that he's tired of being told to read them by people who like reading them.
But I think that what I got out of reading Watts right now is kind of this reminder that, like, even in case, like, one of the main figures here is Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, which
yes.
I think we can, and also Clarissa, which is
Samuel Richardson.
Samuel Richardson. You know, these novels, which at the time were like kind of being written to be somewhat, like, I guess you would say, like educational or didactic on some level. But even in their attempts to be didactic, the more interesting thing is actually looking beneath the surface of the didacticism and seeing kind of the alchemy of like historical and personal forces that are shaping a work of art. And I think that this isn't to say like all books are like equally political, but I think that kind of there's a very shallow critique that gets made of like work that is not dealing with like current events in like a very like heavy-handed didactic way, or somehow like non-political or safe reading or something like that, or that people read these things to escape these issues or something like that. But I think that like if we kind of take the Wattsian lens here and we put that on, we can look at books that maybe at first glance appear to not be political, but find out that, oh, this actually reflects a great deal of like, yeah, historical forces that are just beneath the surface here.
Yeah, and it's worth kind of laying out Watt's thesis as far as I can make it, which is that the factors that influence the rise of the 18th century novel are the middle class, individualism, and philosophical realism as well. And that these factors, while they influenced a lot of the formalistic decisions that get made, they introduce these weird sort of cracks in the surface that you're referring to, wherein a author may say, what would I do if I was on a deserted island? And then, but I'm also a Puritan capitalist. Well, if I'm on a deserted island, I would find gainful employment. Like, and the idea that like that kind of stuff would perpetuate in such situations in a quote unquote realistic manner. And so Watt kind of reads these stories with those discourses in mind and points out that the best ones are often contradictory, or the author claims they're doing something when something else actually happens. Or for all of Samuel Richardson's moralizing, he's quite into talking about sex or like this sort of sexual relations, even if he thinks like religion or something is the way to go. Yeah, there are a lot of contradictions in the content of the form, and that's where Watt spends a lot of his time like sort of looking at.
Great. Well, yeah, Ben, I think you did a good job kind of laying out the basic thesis there, but do we want to talk a little bit about how this book is structured? I know that you know, we kind of in our pre-show chat we're talking a little bit just about the structure of this book and kind of how Watt, you know, kind of lists out his examples to kind of nail down these theses he's trying to talk about. Yeah,
that sounds great.
Yeah. So the subtitle of this book is Studies in Defoe, Richardson, and Fielding. I don't know about you, Ben. I personally have not read any Defoe, Richardson, or Fielding, which did feel somewhat limiting over the course of reading this. But I think Watt actually does do a very good job kind of giving you the important stuff, because look at page count for some of these books. I would not have had time to get through probably. Maybe I could have gotten through Robinson Crusoe, but I think other than that,
Clarissa, I think, is twice, or I made a note of this, I think it's twice as long as all of the Lord of the Rings books. And John, it's written in letters. Well, also, John, from my end, I took an 18th century novel class in undergrad, which was a great class, and we read portions of Moll Flanders, Pamela, but not any Fielding, I think. And also, John, this is another thing where I could talk grad school. One of the things that happens when you get to grad school is you realize that you're reading stuff that implies that you've read a lot more stuff than you've actually read. And the feeling that you get is, well, I just have to read all of it. Except you can't. You can't read all of it. And so in some ways, like, reading this kind of stuff is like making educated guesses and or like, well, maybe I'll look at this or maybe I need to refresh this, but I can't do all of it because that's just the speed and the sort of reference pool that a lot of this stuff works on.
Yeah. No, I think that, something I found kind of interesting reading this book, Watt clearly finds like the underlying like philosophical content of these books interesting, but I don't get the impression that he's actually like a huge fan of these books in terms of like, I don't think he was ever reading this stuff for fun.
Yeah, there's kind of a wearied tone that creeps in here and then where it's just like, and then they just kind of start doing this. Although I will say that I think he rides pretty hard for Richardson's formal innovations in terms of structuring a novel as a series of letters, because I think he gets really into that, and I think he spends a lot of time dunking on Defoe in ways that I find to be kind of funny. But yeah, so
this is to say that like this is like a totally dry or like banal text, just that it's not expecting you to have read these things to get something out of the book, or like I don't get the impression that Watt necessarily wants you to finish this book and immediately be like, oh man, I got to go read Pamela now.
Yeah, it's more like, oh, I get why Pamela was important, and I can now read something that was published now and think about Pamela. Like,
so. Or just think about this succession, within English literature.
Yeah.
Again, that the last chapter I think really is the key to the text, and in some ways I think is probably one of the best parts of the book, just in terms of summating and kind of really looking forward into the future in a way that maybe is a little reductive, but does feel like very, very, it feels like a really excellent summation of his thought, and really lets you see like how he sees these things carrying forward into modernity.
And I feel like we should mention one of the things he does in that conclusion is he sets up this dichotomy between Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, and Samuel Richardson, author of Pamela and Clarissa, against Henry Fielding, author of Tom Jones. And because on one hand, the first two authors are very good at psychological complexity, realistic reporting, and fully developed psychologies. Whereas on the other hand, Henry Fielding, for reasons we'll get into, is more interested in comic settings and portraying an entire working society in a realistic manner, whereas the characters are more like types. And he sort of uses this dichotomy to read a bunch of the developments of the novel after these novels to say, like, here's one author who merges these two styles, here's one author who's really good at one or the other, and sort of you get this nice sort of conceptual lens that you can apply to stuff that you're reading, as well as thinking about the ways that, like, individual subjectivity frequents in the novel, because he spends a lot of time like highlighting, like, for instance, why Defoe, if he was on a deserted island, would get really into gainful employment. Well, it's because he's a Puritan capitalist. And so there's like various things that reoccur in that way in the conclusion, which we'll get into.
Yeah. So just to kind of start digging in here, because I feel like we've kind of laid our groundwork now.
Yeah.
I think that for me, at least, the real core of Watt's argument is about the place that realism holds when the novel is developing in the 18th century. He's, as I was reading, he seems to kind of posit that realism is the thing that separates out the novel from these earlier art forms that we can see as antecedents, things like epics, things like, not romantic poetry.
Like the Renaissance, or
like Renaissance kind of the earlier history of literature. I apologize, listener. My brain, I got like 4 hours of sleep last night.
Cramming for the big test.
But that realism is the thing that really defines sort of this new form of literature developing, and in particular, sort of this idea that society has now reached a level of complexity where people are kind of existing in ways that are visible to each other, but are fundamentally unknowable to each other in a similar way. In sort of the pre-modern era, the vast majority of society is A, illiterate, but B, most people live in like farming communities and villages. You kind of know your neighbors. You probably, never go like further than 20 miles from where you were born. There's maybe exceptions in terms of like aristocrats, but even that is still like a very, that's an existence where people like kind of know what their role is, and how the peasants live, how your fellow aristocrats live, da 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 da. Whereas in modernity, and really with the rise of cities in particular, you have people whose day-to-day experiences, again, you can see your neighbor who is a barrel maker and you're a shoe maker, and that there's probably some kind of commonalities there, but there's also a lot of like very fundamental differences that like you can't fully like wrap your head around. But you're curious because society's reached this level of complexity where, I don't know why this would work this way, but say the barrel business goes under, and all of a sudden the sailors don't need shoes anymore because they can't drop barrels on them. And so, what you thought was your neighbor going out of business, now it's hurting your business. And it's in this way that isn't necessarily like directly applicable to like, there's a drought, so God's mad. So the novel is kind of this thing where it becomes a way for people to think about how other people live. Yeah, where, versus kind of the epic, which is this thing where you have kind of idealized historical figures kind of performing heroic deeds. The novel is much more about thinking through like, how do people react? How do like quote unquote realistic, and we can get into like how realistic is realism. How do realistic people respond to realistic situations?
And too, that sort of individual experience is worth getting. So it might be worth it to talk to that barrel maker because he might know something that you don't. And you can't necessarily assume that he's just like you because maybe you've set up shop in the city, you don't have family here, and so you're there in this individual experience. And this individual experience can be presented to you as useful, if not unknowable, and then also maybe convertible into hard cash. But that's like less of something that we talk about. Like the idea of that like individual experience is important to you as a person. You'll broaden your horizons and it will be useful to you that way. And that you also get knowledge from sensory experience, which is one of the facets of capital R philosophical realism that eventually informs novelistic lowercase r realism.
Yeah, which is, again, interesting when, you just brought up that idea of experience and, the whole idea of kind of the novel rising with capitalism is also really key here because, you have a mass audience for literature for the first time in Western history in a way that you really did not at any other point in time outside of, places like China or something like that. But you have an audience of people who can afford books. You also kind of have writers unshackled from like a relationship to aristocracy and like patronage systems in a way that you did before. And so kind of the individual author's point of view also becomes a lot more important. Something that Watt is clearly very interested in is these individual guys like biographies, their personal like religious and political opinions and how those influence their work, but also like how they are, at least in the case of Defoe and Richardson in particular, are writing with an idea of showing people experiences that you're supposed to take something away from.
You're supposed to learn something. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to be quite as like glib to say like, oh, there's a moral at the end of every story, but there is sort of a thing where Defoe is writing Robinson Crusoe from his particular point of view as this very puritanical capitalist guy. He's like, okay, I want to portray like how would the ideal person with kind of my thoughts and opinions about the world, how would he respond to this situation? And in doing so, like when you read that, you're supposed to be like, oh, when I go about my day-to-day life, I know how Robinson Crusoe would handle this situation. So I know that that's something I should be taking away in my own personal experience.
And on, you know, Samuel Richardson's side, it's I'm going to present how one is supposed to properly do courtship, as well as how what are all of the details that are involved with getting married, also dying. And like that stuff needs to be presented in detail because it's important, and young ladies should know what to do if they're met by a suitor named Mr. B, which I kept unconsciously thinking that the suitor was Mr. Big from Sex and the City. It's like, what do you do when you meet Mr. Big? How do you conduct yourself? What happens? You know, so.
See, I read Mr. B. I read it as Mr. Ben. I imagine it was you.
Yeah, I'm finally getting married.
Coat and top hat.
Yeah, and I start off being awful, and then I become the ideal husband. So yeah, but
Ben, I'd love to see you in one of these like like super tight collars that all these guys wore back in the day.
And I'm trying to sell encyclopedias. Like, yeah, it's like, it'll broaden your mind, sir. Yeah. So yeah, I love the idea that you could just make it like really well as like a bookseller, so much so that people hated you and said you would peddle slop. like they're just like, man, stop peddling slop. Stop selling people all these books. You're influencing what people think. It's like one of the criticisms that like Watts quotes against, like, and Defoe was a bookseller, right? I think, or he worked in So like Defoe kind of has like this firsthand account of like, yeah, selling books, influencing decisions, like getting people to read ideas, which is like sort of one of the like, yeah, historical backgrounds to this.
Well, you know, I think that it's really interesting. And again, I think that it is kind of a thing where maybe we can draw some parallels in the present. I mean, really, it seems like because of the way that all of a sudden kind of this longer established mode of patronage was suddenly just kind of foreclosed on just by the changes in the market. Or I don't know if it was necessarily foreclosed on so much as there were just better opportunities in kind of the capitalist marketplace.
Yeah.
You know, there's kind of a way where these guys were sort of, not to be glib, but kind of influencers.
Yes.
You know,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. They were getting a chance to put their thoughts, their like individual thoughts unmoored from kind of like what like a rich person was paying them to say about like their family or God or something, you know. They were getting to influence the public in a way that was very new and was frankly pretty scary to kind of the powers that be and kind of to society in general. The fact that and particularly you had women reading this stuff and getting ideas from it, ideas that were in some way like very new. You know, Watt makes a point that, you know, the novel is really kind of set up against kind of these older like literary ideals of like the ideal poetique, is it?
Yeah.
Which is obviously that's French, but kind of these like timeless standards for like lyric and poetry that, you know, were considered to be very proper, you know, kind of had all this classical heritage going back to the Renaissance and then back to the Romans and the Greeks, whereas the novel was considered to be this new thing, this thing that had not existed before and was frankly considered generally to be trash.
Well, and too, like that made me think of, because like in Context Collapse, Ryan Rubian, I think Baudelaire is a little bit later than the time period that Watt is describing, but like Baudelaire is famous for writing poetry where he talks about like homeless people, which is sort of like the kind of move that realism does in fiction. Like, let's talk about like people that actually live as opposed to, poetic ideals, universal characters, stock types, like forms. It's like, this is quote unquote life as it's lived. And, you know, Ryan Ruby points out that Baudelaire is like, compare Baudelaire's like addressing this prostitute that he's in love with like Wordsworth pretending to talk to like an old yeoman. he's like, oh, look at that strong old guy. Isn't he cool? And Baudelaire is like, what am I going to say to that prostitute that I'm in love with? Like, there's more of this like a closer encounter with life as it's being presented in realism.
But I think, you know, what it really shows is just the way that modernity has always been this very like fluid, unstable thing, you know, really. I mean, I think you could even make an argument about kind of where we draw that line of modernity and things like that. But kind of at this point in time where capitalism in England is like kind of fully established, and all of a sudden kind of all these market forces are being unleashed and spreading around the world like a virus. You know, it's this thing where things have always been changing. There's kind of this thing where we're always looking towards the past, and we think it's like this stable thing. You know, there's this way where even like we can look back at this period in time, and if you don't have like this kind of Wattian lens on, you know, you can really think that these books are really kind of like stuffy and boring and you know, didactic. And, you know, to us now, they seem that way because we've had like modernism, postmodernism, and you can write about people fucking without getting censored. But there is this way where this is a radical change in like the production of art and people's reception to it.
Yeah.
And you know, sometimes I think about how crazy it is that like how in the grand scheme of things, like mass literacy is like such a small like blip in human history. The idea, like if you went back in time like further than like 300 years, like 90% of people you met would not be able to read a book, let alone own a book.
Yeah, and like Watt even spends time giving the numbers on that and talking about like just how big the reading public would have been at the time. Not that big. The fact that books were kind of expensive, and it was just
incredibly expensive.
Yeah, it was just cheaper to get drunk. That's one of the lines that I liked. Yeah, so yeah, like as you're saying, John, the idea of us being able to read and talk about books is, in the grand scheme of things, very insignificant. So
yeah. Which again, I think raises a lot of questions kind of about like what is like literature look like in the future? You know, what we have these ideas of like what the novel is, what literature is, that we think are, you know, should be stable. But I think what kind of Watt shows is that these things have never been as stable as maybe we think they have been, and that kind of literature is shaped by society, you know, insofar it to a greater degree than literature shapes society.
Yes,
though literature also does shape society.
Yeah, and like even again it's like the rise of the novel, and he sort of presented as like all of these forces combined to produce this thing, and in some ways we're still living in its wake, even if it's changed in various ways. Like I was thinking a lot about how the fact that Barnes and Noble is opening new locations solely on the strength of Book Talk and Romantasy, and the idea that like that's enough of a market now because of the way people read via Book Talk, the kinds of things they read on Book Talk, that we can now have more Barnes and Nobles, which, you know, it's Barnes and Noble. It's not great, but more bookstores, I think, is good. And maybe that means I can, you know, read the stuff that I like. People can read the stuff that they like, and we can coexist peacefully. And we don't have to talk about whether or not we should be reading or what's going on. And I think that kind of trend, I was thinking about that a lot in reading this, and like, yeah, just some of the, and we'll get into this, but some of this sort of dated, I think, gender essentialist things Watt ends up saying at the end of the book, like about how women are better at relational novels and that's why they read them, which is, you know, I don't know. Well, I don't know if we want to get into that, but that's kind of interesting that it kind of came up at the end there. And like, again, like I think it's overall good if more people are reading, even if they're not reading the things that I think are best, because I just think that means that produces some kind of reading culture that we could at least meet in the middle, as opposed to, just us being like atomized.
Well, I think that one thing I think this book kind of helped me put into perspective is that like the book market, there's never been a time when the book market has like been defined by what we might call like fine literature, like high literature.
Yeah.
You know, the kind of stuff that maybe you and I really get into, and that academics put a lot of, and critics put a lot of stock into, has generally not been like what most people were reading.
Yeah.
And particularly like what was popular at the time doesn't necessarily always stand the test of time. But you know, as patron saint of the show Harold Bloom says, you know, the formation of the canon is something no one can really predict. It happens according to its own whims, but it happens. So if people want to read, you know, dragon Gunnar romanticy stuff, be my guest. I think that's not like, it's not so much that like the reading public has degenerated because people are reading that now. I think that if there is like a structural problem with reading, it's the dang phones.
Yeah.
But we're getting a little far afield here.
So we could, should we start talk about Defoe?
Yeah, let's talk about Defoe.
So I'm sure, John, you're familiar with the plot of Robinson Crusoe, but I realized I wasn't exactly. And I think it's funny that Watt kind of talks about how it would have been a kind of Puritan thing to keep a journal and yell at yourself at the journal and say, why don't you better? Why don't you do this more? And like the fact that Robinson Crusoe, one, does that, and two, that made me think of every Paul Schrader movie ever, because almost every Paul Schrader movie is a man in a room tormenting himself, writing a journal. And in some ways he ends up like doing stuff as a result of that. And so Watt focuses a lot on that, as well as the way that Defoe kind of does the fake biography in Crusoe, as well as in Moll Flanders, which is the sort of story of a prostitute who I'm a little unfamiliar with the plot, because I remember I read that in class and like I had a hard time keeping an impression of what happened, which is one thing Watt talks about, where like the book is kind of a collection of scenes, but it's not quite a picaresque because that would imply other societal formations. It's like this new kind of fictional first person fake biography of a character who is drawn from real life, where they have real experiences that aren't talked about in a, you know, natural way.
Yeah, you know, I that was another thing I found really interesting here, is kind of the way that like the idea of fiction seems to be something that like these authors or maybe even like the society as a whole that they're involved, like working within, is like kind of uncomfortable with the idea of fiction. And so there's kind of this need to like sublimate the fact that this is fake by presenting it as like you said, like a journal or a series of letters, which I find that so fascinating. I feel like we've talked about this before in the context of kind of like speculative or like fantasy literature, and the way that you know, I had this theory that like society has to progress to a certain point to where you can like extrapolate out the idea of like a fantasy world that is totally separate from the one you live in. And like the impression you get from reading Watt is like English society at the point Defoe and Richardson and Fielding are writing, they are not there yet. Like they cannot perceive of like a world that is totally unrelated to theirs, even though the island Robinson Crusoe like gets shipwrecked on doesn't actually exist. Defoe wants you to think of it not as kind of a like fantastical, or even kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like a stage. He doesn't want you to think of it as like a stage. He wants you to think of it as like, this is an island that could exist, even as like absurdly like convenient and contrived things are happening. You're still kind of supposed to be reading this with a certain eye towards verisimilitude.
And like what you could do if you got there. Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Which is just, it's fascinating. It's just fascinating to me to think about like society not being prepared for like fiction that does not have this grounding in reality as it's understood.
Yeah, and it has to be presented as an actually existing object, as well as, and I think part of this has to do with Watt makes a note of it, is that these guys are some of the first people to not take their plots from mythology or from stories that we already knew to be stories. And so like you couldn't just sit down and say like, I'm going to write a story about a guy. Like you had to be like, well, this is a retelling of this tale. This is drawing on this mythology. And so I think the idea that you could do the as if at this point requires a lot of like, objectification, like making it into this like thing that exists and not just an as if.
Well, there's also just kind of like almost like a technological aspect to it. You know, it's something that I found myself thinking through, particularly when he's talking about Mole Flanders. And he talks about how at a certain point, Defoe basically like never revised Mole Flanders. And so there's like a scene where she gets like thrown in jail for like attempting to steal a golden watch. And then in a later scene, she gives the golden watch that she failed to steal in the earlier scene to her son before she gets like shipped off to Australia. And Defoe just forgot that he did not have her actually get the watch.
Which that's also a lot like the discrepancies in the Sherlock Holmes Watson stories, where like Watson's like injury moves around his body because like Conan Doyle forgot where it was, or like Watson has several wives because Conan Doyle forgot who they were. Like, yeah, the idea that like you wouldn't have to sit down and revise it, and if you could produce enough text, that would be fine.
Well, it's this thing, I think, again, like it's almost like a technological development of how a story is developed in terms of, writing multiple drafts and working with an editor and, the kinds of like conventions that you learn in like an MFA program that are meant to keep you from making those kind of mistakes. Or if there is a discrepancy like that, to make it be something artful that is meant to maybe show that she's an unreliable narrator or something like that. And it's just not there yet because, that's just not like a tradition or like a way of doing things that has developed and is like economically necessary yet. I think there's also kind of an element where people are reading these things. Again, it's crazy when you read about like how intensely people like were getting into these novels that again, like today we think are so like dry and boring. But people were going into like debt to read these books, or like I really liked reading about the circulating libraries where
slop shops.
Slop shops where you were you'd subscribe to get like individual like because these were all like in multiple volumes because they're like 1,000 pages or whatever. And so, you'd pay like 2 shillings a year and you'd get the first volume of Tom Fielding and then you'd return it and get the next one, like Netflix. Back in the day.
I gotta subscribe. Also, the quote on this is good because I flagged it. Most circulating libraries stocked all types of literature, but novels were widely regarded as their main attraction. And there can be little doubt that they led to the most notable increase in the reading public for fiction, which occurred during the century. They certainly provoked the greatest volume of contemporary comment about the spread of reading to the lower orders. These slop shops in literature were said to have debauched the minds of schoolboys, plowboys, servant women of the better sort, and even of every butcher and baker, cobbler and tinker throughout the 3 kingdoms. Yeah, the idea that you'd have to subscribe to that and then suddenly you're reading stuff that's like not good for you. So,
but I think there's also an element here too, where again, you have a people who are kind of having like their first brush with this art form. And I don't mean to like imply that they're stupid, but you see that discrepancy when you're reading Mole Flanders. And you're not trained the way we are now to be like looking for plot holes,
right?
And to be like making sure that it's hitting all the genre beats like the way that it's supposed to. These people just don't have that programming yet. which makes these things, these novels we're discussing, that Watt's discussing, a lot woolier and weirder than you would expect.
Yeah, definitely.
Again, you think I thought about like, what if somebody like wrote, we're going to be doing Michael Chabon's Telegraph Avenue for our next episode, which he is described as his attempt to write, like basically contemporary Middlemarch. Not as long as Middlemarch, thankfully.
Thank God.
I thought about like, well, what if somebody like came into like an MFA program or like a like a modern like publishing house with Clarissa, with this 1,000 page like exhaustive epistolary behemoth. It wouldn't get published.
Yeah,
like now it could maybe be like self-published like online or something like that
on Substack.
Yeah. But there is this thing where our ideas of like what literature can be have, I think, been really kind of pared down by sort of what the market will accept. And again, I don't know if I'm ever going to get to read Clarissa, but I think it's interesting that kind of like we were saying, where this started versus where it is now. Like, to me, it's this story of refinement, and maybe at this point, like kind of over refinement.
And that was also, not to hype on the Brodernist discourse, but that was one of the fault lines of the Brodernist discourse, was that it should be, in some sense, a good idea that you could read an experimental novel in translation, because you're not going to be able to do that otherwise. And it's given that certain things are sort of the way they are in terms of what gets sold by broader publications. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to that argument because I like experimentation. I like weird stuff. But that was kind of one of the defenses for publishing stuff in translation that's this big and complex, because it's hard to do so otherwise.
Yeah. When I was reading through this, what it really made me think about was people who write like 500,000 page like web novels.
Yeah, like that Harry Potter one that's like as big as the Lord of the Rings novels.
Yeah. So there's still like people who write this way, but there's just no market for it anymore. And there's still presumably people who want to read that way.
Yeah.
It's not how I want to read, but and I think that there's even kind of a thing where I found myself thinking about, again, kind of the way that obviously there were other forms of entertainment besides novels at this time. There were things like the theater and, people playing music, but kind of the way where I think that there is some truth to the idea that like people don't read novels as much as they used to because of movies and music streaming and television. And there's kind of an element where it's like Clarissa probably would not come out as a novel now, but it could probably be it could be a soap opera.
Yeah. And it would be serialized too. Yeah,
it would be, so there's kind of this way where this style of serial fiction has just kind of moved into a different format, which, really, has roots in the novel as well. TV obviously has a lot of theatrical roots too, but none of these things it's never a straight line from just one thing into another thing.
Well, and not to be that guy, but the novel being the definition of like a novel experience, like the idea that you should consume or learn from or experience this thing that is being told to you that you couldn't otherwise, and that maybe it'll be instructive or entertaining or absorbing or diverting. Like that's kind of something that he sort of looks at. And also the idea that you could present individual experience as being important, which he ties to being Puritan. Like the idea of the Puritan's relationship with God is an individual relationship, not one that's mediated via the Pope and a priest. And if you wanted to like translate that onto fiction writing, the idea that I as a author could communicate directly to my readers, well, through a bookseller, but without having to go through literary patronage and being contracted to write something.
Well, that's something that's really interesting then, because something I did find myself thinking again, particularly through these Defoe chapters, is again, we live in a society that has been thoroughly shaped by individualism.
Yeah.
We all now have personal brands. Like at some level, you and I sitting here doing this show is like an individualistic act, even though we're doing it together.
We're selling the idea of the brand of
well, I mean, there's an element here where just the fact that we think that our thoughts are worth putting out into the ether for any number of people to listen to is an individualistic act.
Definitely.
I don't mean that in like a pejorative sense. But it's interesting to look back at this point in history and realize that, that hasn't always been the case. There was a point in time where keeping a journal of your own thoughts was kind of a new thing for a lot of people. It was this, I don't necessarily like radical, like political act, but it was this thing where, again, for a lot of human history, people, even if they'd wanted to, would not have had the means or the skills to keep a journal, just because of how much paper cost and the fact that most people couldn't write. But there, the idea that like an individual person's experiences and thoughts were important enough for them to put down on paper, to want to like have some sense of the continuity of their own like thoughts and experiences. The fact that is actually new and somewhat radical, is cool to remember.
Well, and in fact, John, like an earlier version of that would have been like a commonplace book. And the emphasis is that you take things that other people said, not stuff quotes. That you said. Quotes. Just having a quote.
Reading your Ovid.
Right, having a quote book as opposed to like, here's what I think about Ovid. It's just Ovid says, like this is what Ovid says about love, quote.
But it's one of those things where I don't know. I said earlier, the idea of capitalism is kind of this virus, which we're living in kind of a point where like all these like things in modernity that were radical at one point seem to be like metastasizing and turning kind of nasty,
and like more stuff is getting sold off. Or like
it's also like kind of nice to remember like, like it is cool that like individual people get to feel like their thoughts and feelings matter instead of just being ground under the boot of some aristocrat and just like the iron weight of history on your back.
Well, it's also like, I would have had a great life as a peasant. It's like, if you try to write something down, you'd be killed, like, or something like it's like, things, there are some benefits to this stuff. So,
well, do we want to get into? I feel like we've talked enough about Defoe, and
I want to talk about the letter writing in Richardson, because so
absolutely.
Watts spends a lot of time talking about, when he moves on to Pamela and Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, the fact that they were written as letters. And I think there's something absolutely fascinating about this, because I think, one, in some ways it even suggests emoji and cell phone novels. But the idea that you could better communicate psychology through, one, like intimate writing, and two, that you could communicate something approximately as like instantaneous descriptions of feelings, which Richardson spends a lot of time, or not Richardson, Watts spends a lot of time highlighting as like the thing that gets you. Because like if Defoe is getting you through realism, Richardson gets you in terms of like hooking you by the idea that you can describe what you're feeling as a character, and you can present characters describing their feelings to each other, and you can in some way approximate like a rounded psychology. And I think that is something I always hear about, like, epistolary novels, but the idea that like that kind of transcription can be thematically and formalistically presented is kind of fascinating, and it suggests that like we haven't really moved past that in a lot of ways. Like the idea that we can write cell phone novels and emoji novels and like present our thoughts and feelings in terms of texts and that kind of stuff. And also I have a side digression about middle class self-denial, because I feel like that pops up in the Richardson stuff. But anyway, the Richardson stuff to me was almost some of my favorite parts of the book, because he spends a lot of time talking about the form of the epistolary novel.
Yeah, so one thing I found really fascinating is he describes basically he spends a lot of time talking about like women in particularly these sections.
Yes, yeah.
In some of the earlier sections too, when he's really describing more kind of just the social base of like novel readers in like the first two chapters before he gets into specific details, but particularly in these novels, Pamela and Clarissa, which are obviously very interesting because they are these very exhaustive, like psychological portraits of young women being written by a middle-aged man. Even if he was kind of a girl's guy. Not a ladies' man, a girl's guy.
I wanted to flag that. Yeah, like Watt is like, yeah, he definitely did love hanging out with girls. So yeah.
But he talks about the fact that a lot of the audience for these novels were these kind of very idle, I guess you would say like gentle women.
Yes.
And the fact that kind of the way that, again, capitalism had kind of developed to this point, you had women who at one point, you had like women who were married to well-off men who a generation before would have been very busy like running the household. But all of a sudden they don't really need to be doing things like brewing beer or weaving, because there are all these commodities you can just go buy now.
Yeah.
And so they're idle for the first time. And that gives them a lot of time to read. It also gives them a lot of time to write. And particularly, like you said, letters.
Yeah.
And the fact that he explains that, again, we think of letters as this thing where like, Ben, if I wrote you a letter and I put it in the mailbox tomorrow, I mean, we do live like several states apart. But it would take like a week to get to you. And even if like I put something in like the local mail for someone who lives, in the city I live in, it would still probably take a couple days to get to them.
Yeah.
Whereas because of, again, the different like material realities of the time that these novels are being written, like letter writing was almost more like instant messaging. Not instant, obviously, but the fact like you would hand off, you'd like write multiple letters to like one person in a day. And, you would just kind of like have a conversation via correspondence with your servants, just bringing letters back and forth between your houses. Really kind of changes the kind of timbre of like what a novel in letters means.
And like,
it's this thing where you have, it's conversational in a way that you might not expect.
And it's like the fact that there was all this paper that you could use was like a thing. And the idea that you could spatialize your thoughts is also, he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about it, like kind of fascinating to me. Like, yeah, it changed people's brains. It changed people's brains in such a way that it became something you could do almost, like as if it's instantaneous communication.
Yeah. But then those thoughts are concretized. They're things that you have around. You have this record of your correspondence with another person, or of your own journal, your own thoughts. And you can kind of do what there's kind of this thing where it's almost like Harold Bloom talks about like Shakespearean characters like hearing themselves.
Yeah. Yes. I actually thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, because I think it's exactly what Watt is kind of positing that, this lets you do, except as the reader, you're hearing someone else hearing themselves.
And then you're overhearing. Yeah. So I have a quick quote from Watt about the letter. So what forces influenced Richardson in giving fiction this subjective and inward direction? One of them is suggested by the formal basis of his narrative, the letter. The familiar letter, of course, can be an opportunity for a much fuller and more unreserved expression of the writer's own private feelings that oral converse usually affords, and the cult of such correspondence was one which had largely arisen during Richardson's own lifetime, and which he himself both followed and fostered. In itself, it involved a very significant departure from the classical literary perspective. As Madame de Stael wrote, the ancients would never have thought of giving their fiction such a form, because the epistolary novel always presupposed more sentiment than action. Richard's narrative mode, therefore, may also be regarded as a reflection of a much larger change in outlook, the transition from the objective, social, and public orientation of the classical world to the subjective, individualist, and private orientation of the life and literature of the last 200 years.
Yeah. Which, I want to do like a little aside here and kind of talk through a theory I have about kind of, again, why in particular, like, I think the literary novel is kind of in a weird place right now.
Yeah.
Because, what we would maybe call like the literary novel is very much the thing that grows out of these novels that Defoe is talking about. I think Clarissa and Pamela in particular. And, I think that when people talk about like the novel being dead, that's kind of what they're really talking about.
Yeah.
They're talking about kind of the mid-century, very interiority focused, novel of ideas, something like Stoner.
Yeah, unless we haven't made it clear, listeners, I am an anti-Stoner person. John hasn't read it yet, but I loathe Stoner. Anyway, continue.
But genre literature, I think, is a totally different market. It's a totally different, like, saying people still obviously are reading a ton of genre.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's like more than people were reading in like the 60s or 70s and kind of like the golden age of paperback mass market genre fiction. But I think that it's safe to say that like genre is still doing well in a way that like people are concerned about the death of the fantasy novel the way they're concerned about the death of the literary novel. And part of that is the fact that like people who like reading that stuff don't get the right essays in the New Yorker and stuff like that. But I think that part of what it is the fact that, again, not to be glib, it's social media. It's the fact that we are no longer curious in the same way as we used to be about like our neighbors. If anything, our minds are all too close together.
Yeah.
Between podcasts and 24-hour news cycles and the fact that, you can just sit and scroll through like TikTok or Instagram or Twitter or Blue Sky for hours, and you can just see a billion people's thoughts. Kind of the idea of this kind of close psychological portrait, it's not engaging or appealing in the way that it used to be.
And like in some ways you could argue that you could get it in another form through like vlogs or something, where you just watch a vlog and somebody is doing the kind of selection of personal detail, identification, psychological complexity just through video, and video is just more interesting than reading or something like that. So,
well, I think it's not so much that, but it's that, okay, so like, if I'm understanding Watt's argument correctly, the appeal of the novel is that in a world where you cannot know your neighbors as well as maybe you would, as you would have living in the village, the novel kind of gives you this sort of middle ground where you can approach the other kind of through this work of art and kind of develop empathy for people like who have different experiences than you. Whereas again, today, you don't need a fake version of that. If we want to like take a positive tack on it, again, you can just see what other people are thinking and feeling on the internet all day.
Yeah, you can just open up your feed. Yeah.
And that's real. And you can know like what literally you can go on Nextdoor. You can find out what your literal neighbors are thinking. You'll find out that they're deranged treatlerites, but you can find out what they think.
That reminds me of a tweet I saw where it's like, there should be a rating app for everything. I should be able to look at my friend and I should see that he rated grapes more than he liked Nosferatu. And I should go, he liked grapes more than he liked Nosferatu.
But yeah, it's just this thing where the kind of I'm going to use this term. I don't think I'm using it right, but like the jouissance that the novel in particular like provides.
Yeah.
Like there's just a more direct route to it now. And so when we think about like what the novel might like as it continues to develop, I think that's like, I think that's why, again, you and I are interested in kind of these novels that kind of are blending like literary and genre elements, because I think that is where the novel can still do things that other forms of art can't do.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would say I agree with you, although I feel like Watt doesn't really talk about empathy that much. I agree with everything else you said about Watt's argument, but like there's an interesting angle to Watt's argument where he's saying like there was like an economic motivation to seek new experience, and you can see, to your point, John, like the fact that we get monetized and ads delivered to us on our social media where we do economic, like all of the factors are in place to economically benefit from posting and quote unquote letting your voice be known, which is what they used to say about social media. Like that still all applies to, and I don't know how close Watts gets to the empathy thing, although I do think it is a part of it. I almost think like with Watt, there's like, if like the like the idea of that you get punished for not posting is also like very Puritan. Like the idea that you would be yelled at for not having a personal diary that you share with everyone. Like, you know, that's Puritan. That's Puritan capitalism. But
yeah, you might be right. I don't think he talks about empathy specifically. I think it's there like underneath that.
Yeah,
like
no, I agree.
What does understanding other people mean? And you know, I'm probably like taking other arguments in terms of, like the novel is empathy machine, which is a thing some literary critics have posited, which yes and no. Anyway,
but John, I think your point is correct in that there's a direct route to quote unquote new experiences, other people's experiences that we could use to understand people. And it's shifted to that. And there's an entire economic apparatus that it functions off of that then functions off the data that's generated from that and keeps going in that direction. So,
yeah. And I think that if this is like something that human beings like have a drive to desire, at least like under like capitalism, the novel has to like find new things to do, because this is it's no longer the best at this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I and to kind of amend something to that, I think it's interesting that Watts points out that in the best version of Richardson's novel writing, Psychological Complexity, Confession stuff, that the two characters are disavowing their own natures, which is what Adorno and Horkheimer talk about in Dialectic of Enlightenment, that the structure of the middle class is disavowal, that you have to renounce your true nature in order to preserve yourself as an economic functioning unit, and that you're not allowed to have the thing that you're ostensibly supposed to want. And I think it's interesting, and I'm sure that this is kind of a reach, but I think it's interesting that Watt points out that some of the tragedy of Clarissa is that these two characters deny themselves and don't realize what they're doing, or they fully realize that they're lying to themselves in this doomed relationship that the novel presents. And that Watt's like, this is where the good stuff is. And it's like, you know, that's kind of where Dialectic of Enlightenment is like, yeah, that's the structure of the middle class. That's how the middle class functions. The idea that you need to preserve yourself through self-denial and disavowing. I don't know. That's a thought for another day, but that arose to my brain as I was reading through the Richardson stuff. So
yeah, well, again, I think that's kind of, again, the way that I think in particular, like Clarissa kind of becomes sort of this like bourgeois, like passion play.
Yeah.
Where, you know, again, you're supposed to read it didactically. I loved the bit where he talks about like this old man reading Clarissa and like reading about her dying, and he gets like so emotional. He's like, oh, if I could have a death like 1/10 as beautiful as this perfect creature. You know, again, yeah, it's this way of like, again, in creating art, like it's sacralizing this new way of being.
Yeah.
You know, he talks a little bit about the way that Clarissa in particular kind of is attempting to like figure out how does like Christian death work in a society where death looks different than it did before.
Right. Yeah. The proper burial rites. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you make this thing that has, again, you can't have like the peasant church funeral anymore. That's just not a thing.
Yeah.
So you have to find a way to make death sacred again, and you do it by presenting this kind of secular martyr for the gender binary.
Right. And a quick Watt quote, and then we can maybe move to Fielding. The ultimate barriers that present the union of Richardson star-crossed lovers are subjective and in part unconscious. The stars operate on the individual, though varied psychological forces which are eventually, no doubt, public and social, since the differences between the protagonists represent larger conflicts of attitude and ethic in their society, but which are nevertheless so completely internalized that the conflict expresses itself as a struggle between personalities and even between different parts of the same personality. This is Richardson's triumph. Even the most apparently implausible didactic or period aspects of the plot and the characters, even the rape and Clarissa's unconscionable time of dying, are brought into a larger dramatic pattern of infinite formal and psychological complexity. It is this capacity for a continuous enrichment and complication of a simple situation which makes Richardson the great novelist he is. So I think he rides really hard for Richardson, whereas he likes to dunk on Defoe every so often about just like being a capitalist Puritan on an island. So
yeah, you definitely get the impression that Defoe is the one he's least fond of as a writer.
Yeah,
which seems fair. It does seem like Defoe is really a guy who. Not to say there's no talent there, but he more lucked into just being the first guy to do it, more than like kind of being a really singular like thinker.
Yeah, and I think that serves as a nice transition to Fielding real quick. So the best thing to say about Fielding as an intro is that Fielding wrote a parody of one of Richardson's novels, Pamela, called Shamala, where he just sort of makes fun of everything and the fact that everybody has time to jot down little letters to each other, because Fielding is a upper class, classically trained author who has read the classics. He's mad that people haven't read them and is about to make his mark on the world by writing the comic epic that has not yet been written, which is Tom Jones. And Watts points out in a thing that I find kind of fascinating, that in attempting to emulate the classics, which have broad sort of universal characters, not the psychological complexity that Richardson and Defoe are good at, he sort of realizes that he can present a picture of society. And so we are presented with this sort of societal working of the classical society of the time by trying to present comic situations where characters who are more types than fully rounded people interact. And sort of by way of that, we get the realist novel, which presents society, which is sort of the kind of stuff that we looked at with Middlemarch. Like Middlemarch, in some ways, which was written like almost 100 years after some of this stuff, is like two perfect versions of these two. You get the complexity, but you get the presentation of society. And so Fielding kind of comes in as like the, what's the word? He's the guy that's done all the research, and like this is his take.
So I found the stuff on Fielding very interesting because I think that Fielding comes across as like the of the three authors he talks about, like the one that I'd most like to hang out with.
Yeah.
But there's also this element where Fielding kind of is, I think, this great way of showing the ways in which this like development he's talking about, it's not a straight line. Like Fielding is this guy who's kind of trying to take this historical development and kind of like fold it over on itself, to kind of like bring it in line with his personal like aesthetic, his kind of classical biases. He like poetics, by Aristotle a lot. And was resentful that like basically people didn't know what the rules were supposed to be.
That's so funny. Yeah,
it's very funny. But again, the fact that he does that while also not taking himself seriously in his own way. The fact that again he writes Shamala, which is a parody of Pamela. and then, he wants to write the comic epic. So kind of this way where he is the, like, in some ways a reactionary, but in some ways like a progressive as well. But I also think that Fielding is kind of the birth of like genre literature, I think, in a way. At least, like, I see him as kind of an antecedent to that. I mean, I guess we can say Defoe is as well, with like Crusoe is kind of the archetypical like adventure story.
Yeah.
But I think that the way that Fielding is taking like you said, kind of this idea of like characters as types, kind of hearkening back to the epic and these kind of earlier modes of literature, hearkening back to these rules that are these like very like well-worn grooves and kind of like the collective unconscious.
Yeah, like the unities or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and like using them in this new technology, like kind of slotting those into this new thing. He's kind of, I think, setting the stage for kind of the ways we think about genre literature going forward, kind of the ways in which, again, Lord of the Rings it's a novel. That's what it is materially.
Yeah.
But it's hearkening back to all these older tropes and rules and character types that predate the novel. And Fielding is kind of the first person to be consciously doing that, at least as far as I'm understanding it from Watt.
Well, and to like depicting a society, because that's also what you get in Lord of the Rings. Like, you get this societal depiction. Characters travel from various parts. There's stages. There's development. There's history. Yeah. And like, I think like, and Watt points out, in sort of reducing the characters to types, you can then present the society in detail. Whereas Richardson presents the individuals in detail, and as a result sort of reduces the society to like a type, or like, just not as important. I really like that he pulled this Samuel Johnson line where he goes, Samuel Johnson said, there were between the difference between Richardson and Fielding, there was as great a difference between them as between a man who knew how a watch was made and a man who could tell the hour by looking on the dial plate. So like, just sort of somebody who just sort of looks at something versus, like somebody who knows the details, like the individual. But I think, like, to your point about genre fiction, I think genre is able to, depict worlds, societies, things like that, while not as focusing on quote unquote individual complexity, although that's definitely there in the stuff that we like, that's good. So
well, I think again, it's this question of like, what is the role of interiority in the novel? For a long time, I think that most people who are kind of in like the literary sphere would say that the real strength of the novel compared to other types of art is the focus on interiority, the fact that you can be in a character's head and they can tell you exactly what they're thinking. And I think that's not wrong. That is absolutely a strength that the novel has, and that it still has. Watch a movie that has like a running like narrator over the top of it, and you'll understand like why that still doesn't work as well as it does in a novel. But I think that, again, in this way that feels very like perverse almost, Fielding is again kind of being like, well, if I apply these like older rules to this format, all these kind of new possibilities spring up.
Yeah.
To do things that kind of this different version cannot do. And again, it's this way where, again, it harkens back to things like picaresque and like Shakespearean drama, commedia dell'arte, all these kind of more classical, I guess we would say, forms. But I keep thinking about this as in terms of like he's like building like a Megazord. He's like, Fielding feels like the guy who's creating something that's greater than the sum of its parts. Whereas it feels like I don't want to say that like Fielding's and Defoe are not, but it feels like they're kind of doing that by accident. And that kind of they don't quite add up to as much as maybe Fielding feels like he adds up to. Again, with the caveat that I haven't read any of these novels.
Well, so Watt again on Fielding, as he notes, in his effort to infuse the new genre with something of the Shakespearean virtues, Fielding departed too far from formal realism to initiate a viable tradition, but his work serves as a perpetual reminder that if the new genre was to challenge older literary forms, it had to find a way of conveying not only a convincing impression, but a wise assessment of life, an assessment that could come from taking a much wider view than Defoe or Richardson of the affairs of mankind. So although we must agree with the tenor of Johnson's watch simile, we must add that it is unfair and misleading. Richardson no doubt takes us deeper into the inner workings of the human machine, but Fielding is surely entitled to retort that there are many other machines in nature besides the individual consciousness, and perhaps to express his surprised chagrin that Johnson should apparently have overlooked the fact that he was engaged in the exploration of a vaster and equally intricate mechanism, that of human society as a whole, a literary subject which was incidentally much more consonant than Richardson, which the classical outlook which he and Johnson shared. So the idea that you should be able to have an assessment of society somehow becomes integral to the novel form for Watt, at least.
Well, it's interesting because, again, Fielding being an aristocrat, someone who's at the top of society, is kind of better equipped to see sort of all the gears turning than like Richardson, who is like hang out with his girlfriends and queening out. It's all love.
And Defoe is meanwhile just trying to sell books.
Again, hustling and grinding. In a very classical sense. They aren't necessarily equipped to see things on kind of this kind of older level, this level of being like of the manor born and being able to see all of society and kind of its workings, because you've been by sheer luck, you've just been crapped out on top of the system and you can just see further down than everybody else because you're at the top.
Well, and I think too, like you were talking about genre, I feel like some of the appeal of genre too is that you can present an assessment of a society both real and imagined. So
yeah. But no, absolutely. It's this way in which you use the rules to say something beyond what the rules immediately imply. Yeah. And I think that again, with Fielding, it's this thing of the comic epic, which I was a little unsure of terms of like, I feel like there's obviously I can't think of there's no comic epic poem, but I was thinking about like Hope and like the Rape of the Lock and stuff like that. And I was
was that after that?
I'm honestly not sure, but it feels like, I was wondering about the connection there, because it feels like surely someone had tried to write a longer work of prose comedy before this.
Oh, wait. So the Rape of the Lock was 1712. And I think that's about this time period, right?
Let's see.
When did Tom Jones come out? Well, yeah, Tom Jones was 1749. So maybe.
Now, I mean, obviously, Rape of the Lock is a poem.
Yeah, but not a prose work. Yeah,
it is an epic poem.
Which the novel is not supposed to be. So
yeah, I was curious about. I did feel like Watt takes Fielding very at his word in terms of like, oh, I'm the first guy to do this. And I think in terms of the novel, you could probably make that case. But I did kind of find myself thinking about like Rape of the Lock and stuff like that. In terms
he would probably would have
a kind of epic comedy.
And he probably would have read Rabelais, right? Doesn't he mention like reading Rabelais in French, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, all these guys were reading, again, of his class at least, were reading French authors. So, lots of comic poetry and drama.
Actually, there's a bit about this in Watt real quick. Fielding continued to move away from his earlier literary outlook. He came to see the insufficiency of his early views of affectation as the only source of the ridiculous and therefore of comedy, and his increasingly serious moral outlook even made him find much to regret in two of his early comic favorites, Aristophanes and Rabelais. So I like the idea that he's like, I can't have too much fun. I gotta say something important.
Oh man.
Too much shitting and farting and falling down and then stuff like. I'm a serious literary man, John. I need to write my comic epic that says something about society.
Yeah. Tom Jones, unfortunately, is new comedy, not old comedy. Ben and I are partisans of.
I remember, so this reminds me of a funny story from high school. I remember we were being told about new comedy because our teacher was telling us about new comedy and like new comedy, the comedy of marriage, like, you know, marriage plots, people getting together. And I just said, Professor, what is old comedy? Like, because I never heard of it before. And like, I remember my professor just looked at me and was like, oh, you know, the comedy of the phallus. Like, and I just went, huh? Like, because I hadn't read any of that. But yeah, just having a huge boner, pissing and killing 1 million people because you're a giant, shitting and falling down. Like,
oh man, we might have to do a gargantuan Pantagruel episode at some point.
It would be pretty awesome. We can talk about how much we hate the last book and how great the middle ones are. So the hermeneutics of cuckoldry.
Yeah, I had one other thing I kind of wanted to say here, which I think can be kind of a lead into the conclusion. And I feel like I have been kind of like getting on my soapbox a lot this episode, but I just want to make a case for reading stuff like this again real quick. You know, something I think that particularly, again, you know, this book was written quite a while ago. It's like 1950 something. Yeah, my edition is 1957. So I mean, at this point, you know, this is 75 or so years old. You know, I'm sure that if you went into a contemporary English department, you would probably find people who maybe don't disagree with everything in this book, but definitely like have differing viewpoints about kind of where the novel like starts, how it develops, what its development meant, da 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 da. You know, I think, Ben, you and I are both big fans of Moore's history of the novel, which takes a very different tack in terms of like what a novel even is. It's much more expansive, both historically and like structurally, like idea of the novel that I think is more in line with what we generally talk about on the show. But I think that there is still value in like reading old scholarship. You know, in particular, again, stuff like this, where this isn't like, oh, we found out that there's a new particle that has totally upended like everything that we thought about physics. You know, there's no secret first novel out there that we would find out, and it's like, oh, it turns out the first novel was actually like about orcs having sex with each other. That we have to reconsider all of English literature now based on this, because everyone was reading this and it influenced everyone, but no one talked about it.
Yeah, and it was hidden from view. Yeah, so
it was occluded, like the Mahdi. But you know, I think that it's very easy to kind of get locked in this like trap of, oh, there's no reason for me to read this stuff. I don't have like the background to read it. I'm not an academic. Da 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 da. I think that it's one of those things where, for the, you know, especially with big kind of keystone works like this, most academic writing is not actually as intimidating as like it's presented to you as being. If you have not been in academia, I think that there's a lot of like discourse around like academic writing is too hard to read. Not really. It's denser. You might like read a little bit slower than you would like a popular nonfiction book. But I think that with the humanities in particular, these ideas kind of are always interesting, even if they're not necessarily the most current thing in the world. And I think that something we both think, and you can tell me whether or not you agree with this, Ben, you know, there is a lot of value to be found in just kind of reading ideas kind of on their own terms,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you don't have to agree with them 100%. You don't have to change your whole worldview based around them, but reading and understanding like differing viewpoints on things, and in particular like this kind of stuff, theory, history, it can tell you not just about like the thing it's literally about, but it can tell you about like how other people think about the things you're reading about.
Yeah.
It can influence your thinking, even if it doesn't, you don't necessarily agree with everything it says. This really changed the way I view, again, the novel, not necessarily as like a total art form, because I do think that it's more expansive than this, but this did make me think a lot about what does it mean for like mass literacy to develop. That's like a total, that's different than maybe like what it says on the tin, but the alchemy that's like happening in your brain as you read stuff is always more than just like in one ear, out the other.
Yeah,
So,
there are material forces that have like made this possible. Like the idea that we could do this and talk about this and read this way. And I think I like that you brought up Stephen Moore, because I think Stephen Moore is interesting in that, like, if we were telling the normal story, it's like, the novel got a lot weirder after this. And like Stephen Moore, is saying kind of like, it was always kind of weird. And if we define it as just like a long enough prose piece, then we can see some interesting things. Whereas like, Watt is looking at like the realistic novel, like what are the forces that produced that? And, what is the culmination of this trend if it's not these three guys? And I think too, I also think Watt's pretty good at writing academic writing, in that like he always presents like evidence in a way that's interesting and funny and informative. And his conclusions are always like kind of poetic. And I think that's some of the interesting things about academic writing, because it's like, you're not exactly allowed to go crazy, because you're supposed to, one, tell us what your argument is. You're supposed to, two, keep telling us what the argument is so we don't forget it, which could be kind of annoying to me personally. But I think Watt always does it in a way that evolves it. And also, to me, makes me feel bad about my own academic writing, because it's not this neat and poetic and funny at times, because there's a very particular view on the things that he's presenting. And I think in terms of reading it, it's pretty good, and it can follow and progress in a way that makes sense. And I think too, I had another point about this that I completely lost. But I think, yeah, John, I agree. It's worth reading this. Oh, here it is. So I like that you brought up the date that it came out, because I think he doesn't get into it, but I think you can, as I brought up New Criticism, you can kind of read this as an explicit response to New Criticism, which is, there's a lot of important historical detail that goes in the creation of these novels. Let's not just ignore that just for the sake of the formal elements at play. Like the idea that we could learn something from the material, historical, philosophical forces that produce this stuff is important. And you can learn about that, and you can realize how maybe things have changed, but can also be the same. And yeah, just a different takes on ideas. So I agree with what you're saying 100%, John. And I think like you could even further contextualize it in terms of like, yeah, the new critics are a little up their own ass for trying to occlude all of that stuff. Although he doesn't really get into it explicitly, but I think you could maybe see it as that.
well, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for The Rise of the Novel right now, and the last section is New Criticism, saying significantly Watt challenges the pervasive New Criticism literary theory, in which a work of fiction functions as a self-contained, self-referential aesthetic object.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the conclusion, because I feel like we're starting to get a little long in the tooth here, but
Yeah.
I do think that conclusion is worth talking about.
Yeah, so a couple of notes for the conclusion that I think is interesting. The idea of people reconciling Richardson and Fielding, such as Jane Austen, Lawrence Stern, and then that Ulysses by James Joyce is the height of the 18th century novel. And again, that dichotomy he presents as Richardson and Defoe as individual realism, but Fielding as societal realism, meaning that the author has to say something about society, or at least present an assessment. Watt makes sort of a defense of why Jane Austen is good, as well as I think saying some things about how like women are better at talking about individual relationships than men. which I don't know, but like I don't know. It's the 50s. You can kind of make broad assessments about gender if you want at that time, but we don't necessarily, I think, do that now. So, but
yeah, I like the conclusion because I think that it really kind of brings the title of the work back into focus. This is the rise of the novel. This is not like the golden age of the novel. It definitely feels like Watt sees these works as important, but sees them as fundamentally like lacking something until these later writers that were really more familiar with.
Yeah,
a lot more people are reading Jane Austen than are reading Tom Jones these days, for better or worse.
And more than I would say James Joyce, because I feel like anytime I talk to people who read, they don't like Joyce anymore. I guess because he's so touted as like the big man, the master, and it's like, and so people are like, I don't need to read that. And I feel like I read a lot of Joyce when I was just reading a lot. And I feel like that was the right time to read him. And like, obviously it would be worth it to go back. But to me, I find less people who know Joyce of the, like, it's like nobody reads Joyce. Nobody really knows about Stern. People do read Jane Austen.
Yeah, which there's a lot of reasons for that. The fact that Austen is this kind of really unique writer in terms of the fact that she really just does bridge this divide in terms of people who are quote unquote like literary and like snobs like her, but also people who just like reading romance novels like her.
Yeah.
And, all the movies they made of her books are super popular and get people to like want to read the books, which is very uncommon for like a 18th or 19th century author. But yeah, Austen is, I feel like we should do an episode on some piece of Austen at some point, because it feels like she's just a really intriguing figure that I'd love to do some more thinking about.
And like from Watt's perspective, she can present these characters who have psychological complexity, but who are not exactly types, but they are types of a certain kind of society. And she could present an assessment of this society as well. So from Watt's perspective, she can merge the Richardson Fielding development, and while Stern can do something similar, but in a way that's a lot more reflexive and at times almost postmodern, from at least my experience of reading Tristram Shandy.
Yeah. No, it's this thing where it's the dialectic,
Yeah.
We're reaching the synthesis in Austen.
And then from the other end of the telescope on the Joyce side, it's like the exhaustion of detail in which Richardson presents these two relationships, Joyce can do from a objective, like describing objects, as well as doing stylistic forms, as well as presenting things in different points of view. Like basically people say in Ulysses, he just exhausts the repertoire of the novel as an art form by every single chapter does something and talks about something and explains something and does like a point of view. And then in Finnegan's Wake, he's like, what if I just wrote puns all the time? And I did what I just did in Ulysses in the level of language itself, like the puns that are available, the different kinds of languages one can speak. And it becomes even more of a like exhaustion. And Finnegan's Wake is actually in some ways like funnier than Ulysses, but it also requires so much work to read that it's almost like impossible. So,
well, I feel like this is maybe getting a little off topic. You're just saying like you feel like Joyce is kind of not as popular anymore, even with again kind of like bookish types. And I feel like there is an element there where Joyce is in a way that like I feel like a lot of like postmodernists are going to be a lot harder to go back to in the future, just because again the referentiality required to read someone like David Foster Wallace. You kind of really have to know the world he lived in to understand like the references he's making and things like that. I feel like Ulysses is somewhat similar. I can't speak to Finnegan's Wake. Whereas Austen, again, really like has this gift for, and again, I don't know how much of this is just the fact that, again, there's films and things that kind of like people can wade in and kind of get an understanding of things without just getting like dropped into the deep end.
Right.
But it does feel like there is just this element where Austin is just much more able to have this timeless quality. Whereas if you don't know if you don't know anything about the ring cycle, you're not going to know what Balmung is. You're not going to understand why he yells that out when he hits the chandelier with his cane.
Yeah, you're not going to understand what he's talking about most of the time. Why are these characters in a mask? Why is he suddenly turned into a woman? Like, yeah, that's like, obviously I don't know if we should do a Joyce episode, but like, there's a reason that only like literary types like him now, because he requires this wealth of reference, but he does really get jiggy with it in a way that's like fun to read. So, but
particularly relevant to bring up. One thing I did think was interesting was the way he brings up kind of French realism at the very end.
Yeah.
I've really been wanting to we have both read some articles by Brandon Taylor. I'm sorry for Brandon Taylor, very talented essayist. I haven't read any of his fiction, but he's a very good essayist. He did a series of essays on his experiences reading like all of Zola over the course of 2 years. And I've really kind of been wanting to get more into like French literature. It's a tradition I'm just not particularly up on, but it seems like there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
Also, did you catch when Watts says like capitalism hit Britain first?
Yeah.
Which is why they were developed realism like almost before French realism. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And then French realism is kind of this, it's comes out like more like Balzac and Zola are like more developed than anything Watts talking about, because
and Stendhal too. Yeah, that's the other one that gets brought up. Yeah,
because like just this again historical material process was just like that much more far ahead by the time that people started writing novels in French.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know that we're like strict materialists on the Infinite Library, but it is just always interesting to think about art as a technology. I think that's why we both got so much out of Context Collapse.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
It's not the only way to look at these things, but it's an interesting like lens you can choose to look at these things through. And I think it'd be really interesting to kind of like pick up some Balzac now and think about that in relation to this.
And Flaubert too, because he's another big,
Oh yeah.
psychological complexity, assessment of society, and then he ends up getting like more crazy as he gets older, like Bavard and Pichet, which I love. And then somebody just told me he wrote this insane poem about the saint that hallucinates in the desert that's worth reading.
Oh, Saint Anthony?
Yeah, Saint Anthony. He wrote some like insane poem about Saint Anthony towards the end of his career. And then after this it's like Henry James, those the big time again, assessment of society, psychological complexity, and then it's the modernists. So
yeah. Well, Ben, thanks for coming along on this adventure with me. I from the copious notes you took, I'm going to say it feels like you had fun.
No, I mean, I definitely did. There was a kind of the feeling of being back in coursework, which like is important to remember. And I always got a lot out of coursework, but like those feelings of like, I need to be prepared. I need to take notes on everything. I need to say smart stuff in class. It was nice to revisit that. And I also feel like, again, I was thinking about the current controversies of Brodernism and romanticy bookstores and like the way people talk about novels. It felt even more important, I guess, in a way that it kind of can feel like a Twitter post. Like it's important to kind of see the whole picture, much like Fielding kind of says. So it was nice to get that again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's something where, again, I think we're so used to thinking of art as something that just kind of, again, emerges from like the ether of like individual genius, that it's really good to remember like the historical context for all this stuff, not just books, but, any art form. Because it's really the only way to make sense of like where you are now is to understand where you've been and hopefully to understand where you're going from there. So
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you liked this episode, which I hope you did, definitely let us know, because I think that I'd be open to doing something like this again in the future. Maybe we can kind of do like some great hits of literary, like history and theory. You can follow the show on Blue Sky at infinitelibrarypod.bsky.app, I think. I'll check that. Just look up Infinite Library on there.
Yeah, we're on Blue Sky. We're also on YouTube, so give us a follow on YouTube.
Follow us there. I feel like that's really the only social media platforms we're very, very active on right now. If this is your first time listening, you picked an interesting one to start with.
Again, the theme of being the student who wanders into the class, like you're like
go, if you liked it, the other episodes are pretty different, but go ahead and subscribe and leave us a review. That's really big for helping the show find more listeners. But yeah, other than that, that is about it for tonight.
Yeah. Read theory, December books.
December books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir.